Hey everybody, Martin from Quad Spinner here, and today we're going to be discussing the Erosion2 node. Erosion2 is the node that covers hydraulic and, to a point, thermal erosion in Gaea 2. Hydraulic erosion is the erosion caused by precipitation, aka rain, and snow, which turns into water flowing down the terrain. Thermal erosion is the contracting and expanding of sediments due to temperature shifting from cold to hot. Hydraulic erosion cuts into a terrain, causing gullies and valleys, while thermal erosion chips away at a terrain, causing slanted slopes and talus flows. I think a lot of you are very keen to learn more about this node because sometimes it can feel hard to control. It can deliver such varied results that small changes have a big impact, unlike the old node Erosion1. On that note, something important to remember is that Erosion2 is a completely new node, and when you work with it, you should avoid thinking of it as something similar to Erosion1. So today we're going to be discussing the node in depth with every control, and I'll show you guys a few use cases in the form of this Scottish highland terrain and this interesting snowy peak. I'll just show how Erosion2 can give you these very, very different shapes even when you're using the same underlying primitive. So let's get into the settings. This will be the bedrock for our duration and downcutting showcase. So duration is of course the duration of the simulation. In Erosion2 it's very cool because you can even see how the erosion slowly creeps up. So you can imagine this is like a coastline that is slowly eroding, and you can really see how it slowly chips away at the whole terrain. Downcutting, quite easy. It's the strength at which the erosion cuts down into your terrain, how deep the gullies are. If we lower this, we'll see that the gullies become a lot less deep. They will, of course, slowly become deeper as we increase the duration. However, depending on how quickly the actual slope tapers off, they won't reach a certain depth. If we turn them up really big, you can see here right now that the actual terrain just gets totally eroded very aggressively right in the beginning, and then it kind of tapers off. Next up, we have a very interesting setting that maybe not enough people know about. It's the erosion scale setting. Erosion scale determines the largest gully size across the entire terrain. So when we have the erosion scale set to 1,000, the gullies will be a certain size, as we can see here. And when we turn it down to 500, you'll see that they have actually scaled down quite a bit, drastically changing our terrain, keeping the actual base shape of the terrain a lot more noticeable. And we see that the terrain is either larger scale and we're just seeing more gullies because of the actual distance that we're looking at the terrain from, or it's just more micro detail on this certain terrain. You can go even further down to 250. You'll see a lot more, and we can just keep scaling this down until we get very cool results. Erosion scale basically determines the size of the gullies that the hydraulic erosion causes, and it can give you very different and very interesting results. And I would definitely use multiple erosions with different erosion scale for different, gully sizes. One for the big valleys and one for the small little creeks, in a sense, coming down the mountain. Super interesting. And let's move on to the sediment. So this will be the bedrock layer for the sediment. The sediment discharge settings are probably the things that most people know the least about and want to know more of. So let's get started with suspended load. Suspended load are the lightest sediments and move very quickly, meaning they don't settle quickly and often will run to the end of the terrain when the slope allows. These can greatly affect the shape of the terrain and as such are often turned on at maximum by default. So when we look at the suspended load, it's pretty much the gullies. It is the actual erosion that's happening onto our bedrock here and cutting away at it. When I turn this way down, you'll see that the gullies become a lot less deep and there's less of them. The discharge angle is the angle at which it starts. So right now at an angle above 24 degrees, the actual erosion will start cutting away at our terrain. And if we lower this, you'll see that the actual gullies become a lot more intense because more of the terrain is actually being eroded. So you'll see a lot more of these gullies even form on these flatter areas of the terrain. And that is just the discharge angle working. If we turn it up, the suspended load will become less extreme. Turn this up. And there you go. Next, bed load. Bed load are the slightly less mobile but still quite pervasive sediments. It creates sediments easily, but these sediments only travel moderately. Increasing this sedimentation can help larger talus flows and other deposits form, However, it should be used with care as it can become quite overpowering. It's not necessarily overpowering on this specific example. However, in individual like mountain ranges or such, it could be quite a lot happening. So when we look at this right here, you can instantly see the bed load at work, causing these flows. And you can also see that it flows all the way down the mountain. So even at a higher discharge angle here of 37, where it really sticks to these higher angles, it will still flow all the way down. Lower angles, you'll see that the actual flows only start way down here and the gullies are still very much empty at higher angles. And you can see it here creeping up a bit, creating that talus. However, there is another sediment that is even less mobile, the coarse sediments. Coarse sediments represent loose soil, rocks, boulders, and other loose material on the terrain that can create impressive screen, talus, and alluvial fans. These sediments settle quickly and as such create very distinctive sedimentation patterns. So this sediment is probably the easiest to recognize when you're working with it because you can really see it move across your terrain very noticeably. So if you have a cliff, often you'll see these rocks that fall down, but they don't really flow down the whole mountain or into the actual like gullies that the hydraulic erosion is creating. Often this coarse sediment is a bit more of a thermal erosion effect where just rocks are getting chipped away from cliffs and they fall down. They might roll down a few meters, but they don't necessarily flow down the whole mountain, creating really cool talus flows, basically. The cool thing about this sedimentation is that we can really follow it on its way up. So if I just slowly move this upwards, you'll see that it slowly starts creeping up. However, it stops. Unlike bed load, which keeps moving, you'll see that the actual gullies from suspended load are visible again after a certain angle as this actual coarse sediment starts moving up the actual cliff slopes. The gullies from the suspended load are becoming visible again at the bottom. This is in opposition to the actual bed load, which keeps flowing and fills up the gullies even at the bottom. Even when it stays up here, it fills everything up. Yeah, altogether, they can give you quite an impressive sedimentation on your mountain. Something to note here is that the strength of all of these is not individually controlled. So when I turn up the strength for all of them, it doesn't mean that they're all at 0.5 strength. They're actually all at 1/3 strength. So if I turn them all up to 1, right now every single one is working at 1/3 of its strength instead of all at 100. It's because they're basically all working in tandem. The team is working on a setting where you can increase the amount of sedimentation volume without the actual erosion being affected at all. So it's kind of like artificially increasing or multiplying the amount of sedimentation that you're getting without it necessarily being realistic. So this will be the next terrain we're going to be eroding with the shape controls. So shape controls are basically the thermal controls that Erosion2 offers. Basically the thermal erosion that you'll see, and it really helps blend or tie in the hydraulic erosion in a lot of cases. You can also really strengthen these controls and get really unique shapes. Yeah, I won't be going in too deep about every single slider because they're very connected to the actual settings up here. All you need to know is that this will be basically the strength in general of this control, so we can turn it up more and more. The sharpness will also sort of control the strength of the thermal, but more of the shape strength. So the higher we turn this, the more triangular and slanted the actual shape will become. The shape detail scale basically controls the amount of detail of the underlying layer that we still see right here. So if I turn this all the way down, you'll see that we're going to get very sharp shapes, but all the actual shapes from this underlying layer are kind of disappearing. There is some artifacting, but actually this artifacting can become really cool because it can create these cool cliff faces. So now we're going to go to the orographic influence. The first thing we're going to cover is the directional precipitation, which is basically the rain shadow effect. Rain shadow being rain being blocked by one side of the mountain range. So it rains on one side, and then on the other side, there's not much rain because it all fell on one side due to the actual mountain blocking it. Creating this cool effect where one side of the mountain is basically eroded very heavily, or at least has some erosion on it, and the other side of the mountain is not eroded at all or a little bit. This radial gradient shows it very extremely. However, with an actual mountain terrain, it will be less extreme. And with the actual rain shadow effect here, we can control the harshness of the fall off in a sense. And the direction, of course, changes the direction. Now we're going to go to the actual masking controls here. You can even plug in your own custom mask, but right now I'll be using the controls inside of the node, which is the precipitation controls here. So I can basically say where precipitation on the mountain will fall and where it won't. So right now I'm saying that it won't fall on any slope steeper than 45 degrees, and it won't fall above an altitude of the 0.75. So basically the top quarter of our mountain is not receiving any rainfall, and it shows. We're still getting the thermal erosion, like thermal effects here, but we're not getting any of the hydraulic erosion causing these flows running down. I can reverse it and we'll see a lot of these flows on the top of my mountain and not at the bottom really. However, you'll think, why is there still flows down here if it shouldn't, be? I masked it out. Well, the difference is that once the actual rain has fallen, it has to flow down the mountain. This is not like Erosion1 where you could plug in a mask and basically turn off the erosion strength. This is pretty much only controlling the precipitation. So the rainfall, snowfall, any way liquid gets on the terrain, pretty much. So yeah, once liquid hits the top of a mountain, it's going to flow down. So your flows are still going to go down all the way. Basically what this is just controlling is that there's no rainfall down here, so no new flows are being created down here, which of course you'll see happening here in case I reverse it. Yeah, pretty much that's the orographic influence. You can see how much of a change that is. This is kind of an interesting point right here, because as we see, the erosion settings are very, very strong. You can get so many different effects with a single node. The tiniest change will actually affect your mountain quite a lot. Now, how can we change certain things like adding sediment to this mountain without changing this shape? Like imagine I'm really locked into this shape and I want to keep it. However, I don't want to have any changes when I turn up the bed load, which I might get, Well, in that case, it is just advised to just use another erosion node, setting the blend mode to max. And then we can just turn down the down cutting, turn up the bed load, turn up the angle. And now we have very amazing control here over the actual sediment flow. I would recommend using the same erosion scale. This way you make sure that the actual sediment buildup is really going into every gully, as the actual scale of the gullies is the same. It's not 100% necessary, but it's just something I advise. So now that we've actually covered all these sliders and all the ways we can use Erosion2, I have these cool examples that I made for you guys, which are two very different terrains from the same primitive, showing how the erosion in different settings can give you totally different results. So we have this cool highland terrain, hopefully it's cool, that I created for you guys, and a very snowy peak with a very heavily thermally eroded look to it. Yeah, I mean, personally, I love the shapes and I love how different they are. And I love how Erosion2 can give me these results from using it in different ways. So let's start with the actual snowy peaks. Why not? We'll start right away by creating this shape that is almost 90% of the work. You'll notice that the actual terrain here is very heavily thermally eroded, and that is the shape controls right here really putting in the work. So at a duration of 25, we're getting quite strong erosion, down cutting at 0.1, so not 0.25, so we're actually avoiding it going too deep into the terrain. The suspended load is the default settings except for the discharge angle at 15. This just made my gullies a bit wider as the actual erosion started happening a bit earlier up, eroding a bit more of the sediment away. Bed load very low, 0.1, just to create this kind of base. Just to create this kind of base flow here at the bottom. No coarse sediments, as I didn't feel like I needed to put any big talus screens on the cliffs here because it will be covered up by snow. These shape controls, so 0.6, very high shape control like effect here. Shape sharpness, which is basically just the sharpness of the actual thermal shape, so the As you can see this ridge, you know, like the very sharp triangular shape. Shape sharpness kind of does that for you. Shape detail scale. This will kind of be the amount of details that are coming from the primitive over to the actual eroded terrain here. So you'll see it's 0.05, which is very low. The base value is 0.25. And you'll notice here that like these kind of like almost cliff stratified little areas are very hardly noticeable at this point because they've just been kind of blurred into the terrain in a sense. They've kind of been melted into the terrain. If I turn this way up, then you'll see that the actual stratification here will be way more noticeable, and a lot more of these details in the terrain will be noticeable. A cool effect that you'll kind of find here is that the if you work with a lower shape detail scale and a higher shape sharpness, and of course in general just a higher amount of this thermal control, you'll start seeing these cool cliffs form almost naturally. It's very interesting how this happens. It really shows the Erosion2 node working at its full magic, where it just starts kind of creating these very good looking cliffs in this very high peak terrain. And yeah, they work perfectly. Now, when you're working with these higher shape controls here, I find that the actual differences between resolutions start becoming a bit more noticeable because the actual controls are so strong at this point that the slightest change in the simulation will just have a totally different look, because the actual thermal erosion on top of it is also changing the whole terrain. So if you like this kind of look right here, I would say bake this node down if you want to, and then we can actually work on detailing, which we'll do now. What I'm doing first is using Transform 3D, drop to the floor, and then scaling it up by 1.35 because I don't need all this flat dead space around my mountain. So I'm just going to move up the actual terrain, or scale up the actual terrain. And I'm just going to get a slope mask right here and start warping. As you know from my Snowy Peaks video, I love putting this iterations to 4, and I put the roughness to 0.6, so we get a bit more of a cool high detail warp right there. Just warping those cliffs so we get some cool rock detail. Add another warp set to max, and just added a height mask there, so we just get some extra rocky bits right in this area. And then we're going to get another slope mask and run a thermal 2 for the snow. We're not necessarily using this for our terrain, but the actual snow field that we'll throw on top. This thermal 2 will kind of create these cool snowy erosion that we'll see here. And then of course masking out the area mask here to maintain our cliff detail. And then adding a snow field with 6 cascades and all kinds of settings to make sure the snow sticks on top of the terrain. I would definitely play around with this at a lower resolution when we use the snow field, because these 6 cascades will take its time to actually build itself up, but the end results are so amazing. This snowfield node has such better fall off for the actual snow compared to the old snow node. So I definitely will be using this one in the future for my snow. A choke point and the texturing. So just a texture base, sap map, weathering, a file. I use a Quixel rock texture here, change the color a bit. Then I create a height selection here, just mix between the two. So if I underlay this here, there you go. I will just blend this sap map slightly at the bottom here. It could be more, maybe something like 0.5. There you go. I love using the actual textures when it comes to mountains like this, because for some reason sap maps are great, but you don't get the same detail that a texture will give you. And yeah, when we run this through actual color erosion right here, you'll see that it just really works for a terrain like this. And then we're going to use a slope map to select our cliffs and multiply that on our snow to make sure there's no snow covering our cliffs. Screen that onto our rocky ground layer and throw it in the light X for some cool lighting. And there we go. Here is the cool snowy, I don't know, alpine, very high altitude mountain terrain that you're going to get. Now let's go for the highland. Starting off with the mountain Erosion2. So in this case, you'll notice a lot less duration here. The down cutting is 1/4, so it's a little stronger. The erosion scale, I kept it at 1,000 because it's clearly a less large scale terrain than the huge alpine mountain here. It's more of a hill than a mountain. The actual coarse sediment and bed load I didn't touch in this case because I decided to add them later on. The shape controls, so we have very similar here, shape 0.5, 0.6, and 0.01. I really wanted this hill to be eroded quite heavily as an all terrain, so not too many details still left. It's almost like a hill basically. I will add details to it. The shaper here will just bulk up this hill so it's less pointy and a bit more round. Sorry, I had an old node here that was not doing anything. But yeah, we're gonna add a warp with a max blend mode, and this is just gonna give me cool rocky outcrops. And look at the settings here, not super special, but this is my way of just adding instant cool detail popping out of my terrain. Then Erosion2 on top of that, we're gonna add a way smaller erosion scale because this will just affect our small like gullies here, just a smaller erosion on the terrain. It's visible everywhere, and it's going to really help blend these rocky outcrops into the terrain that it's put on top of. So you see here, still no bed load, still no coarse sediments, only a little bit of shape control here just to have a little bit of thermal erosion, blend this whole terrain a bit better into each other. And now we're going to use an Erosion2 with a blend mode set to max to add the actual sediments. So right here we'll see our cool terrain. However, these gullies are of course ridiculously deep, and then we're going to fill them up with some sediments right here. Duration quite short, down cutting quite low, erosion scale set to 1,000, as that was kind of the scale of the first terrain with the big gullies. And you can see that it works very nicely, and by keeping it all separated, I'm able to increase the volume of debris and all those kind of things without affecting the underlying layer. At this point, I'm going to add some cool rock detail using a purlin and a fractal terracing. I'm going to get really insane details here, use a slope mask, and then throw that on top. So we're going to get these cool kind of like sedimentary layers in our rock. And at that point, we're going to have our choke point. Now, the dusting here is going to be our primary mode for snow. I'm going to set the flow to a very low number, 0.001. I do this because it blends a bit better. If you put it to 0, I feel like the mass becomes very harsh. So when you have the flow at a very low amount, it won't flow over your cliffs or like your sloped areas, but it will still be a bit more soft. And then to make it softer, we're going to use color erosion with a high diffusion, which is going to just kind of blur it a bit naturally. For the texture of the mountain, we're going to use a texture base with 2 sap maps. We're going to get a sap map for the rock and a sap map for the vegetation. The sap map for the vegetation I further enhance with a soil mask set to soft light, which is just kind of going to darken some of these areas and brighten some of the other ones. Just kind of going off my reference here, right? At this point, I get a slope mask with a height mask on top of it. So we're basically creating the rocky layer here, or the rocky mask. All the dark areas will be rock, all the bright areas will be grass and vegetation. I'm going to run it through a color erosion that is very strong, and I'm going to set it to the min blend mode. This will preserve our mask that is laid on underneath. So we're only getting more rock flows basically added to this, using a curve to just strengthen and make it more contrasty, and then we blend the rock and the vegetation masks together, creating this underlying texture, to which we're going to add our snow with screen, and then throw it in the light X for cool lighting. There you go. Erosion2, creating 2 totally different shapes, a very alpine shape and a highland shape. I hope this was very useful, and I hope you understand Erosion2 fully now. If not, hit me in the comments with some questions. I will definitely take a look and see if I can help you guys out. Thanks for watching, and we will see you on the next video explaining the next node.